Hey everybody, and welcome to this very special Point North one-shot. I'm Alistair Stevens, and tonight in the first of our two-part series looking at The Princess Bride, we're going to talk about The Princess Bride. Not the movie, not the classic 1987 movie, which I think every single person on Earth loves and has seen so often that they can repeat every line of dialogue verbatim. At least I know that I can. But rather, we're going to look tonight at the original William Goldman / S. Morgenstern novel. More on that in just a moment. A quick announcement before we get into this one-shot. There have been some recent changes over on YouTube. I talked in the advanced materials for this particular one-shot, in this Week on Point North, in fact, about the possibility of a live commentary track for The Princess Bride, and that now seems very likely because I want to kick the tires on a new function that they are offering over on YouTube. As you know, we transitioned away from YouTube to Crowdcast here at Point North a while back because Crowdcast lets us have more immediate chat and keeps the chat after the live discussion is finished so that we can go back and look at it and bask in your brilliance, all of you who are joining me here live. And YouTube has now just added similar functionality, as well as a new super low latency mode, which should make it more immediate for you all to chat as a part of the live discussion. So stay tuned for a future announcement about a live commentary track for The Princess Bride. I think that would be the perfect time to kick the tires of this new YouTube system. That probably won't happen before next week's one-shot. I think we'll discuss it first and then embark on our voyage of discussion and silliness as we watch The Princess Bride together. I can't wait for that. As I say, stay tuned for more information. William Goldman was born in Chicago in 1931. He studied at Oberlin College in Ohio as an undergrad, then earned an MA from Columbia in 1956, which was, coincidentally, the same year in which he wrote his first novel, The Temple of Gold, which he wrote in a frankly astonishing 3-week period. He wrote 4 more novels over the course of 8 years, despite being horribly afflicted with writer's block with regard to his novel Boys and Girls Together. By the mid-1960s, he was working as a screenwriter in Hollywood. In 1969, he wrote the original screenplay for the classic Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, for which he won an Academy Award. He worked pretty consistently through the next few years, in fact, through the 1970s and 1980s, publishing the original version of The Princess Bride in 1973. After writing this novel, he went on to do a few things of note. He won an Academy Award for his screenplay for All the President's Men. He wrote Misery and Memoirs of an Invisible Man and Maverick and many, many other scripts, some of which I guess didn't even begin with the letter M. Obviously, he carved out a niche for himself, crafting scripts that began with the letter M, but there were other things happening in his life too. Yes, Karen's pointing out here that he was also the brother of James Goldman. Yes, indeed, he was. It is fair to say that William Goldman, completely apart from The Princess Bride, he's still alive, he's still with us, thankfully, has had a phenomenal storytelling career. He has been hailed as one of the preeminent American storytellers in the latter half of the 20th century, and that is a well-deserved reputation. In The Princess Bride, though, he does something completely unexpected. He does something completely unprecedented, and he does it, I am pleased and proud to say, beautifully. In The Princess Bride, Goldman gives us an abridged version of the classic fairy tale romance / historical satire, I suppose we can argue, and will in fact argue over the course of the next hour, the degree to which Morgenstern's original was a satire. This book, as I say, written by S. Morgenstern, this is a novel that was read to the young Goldman by his father, who, like Morgenstern, was an immigrant to the United States from Florin in Europe. Returning to the book after many years, Goldman discovered that it wasn't exactly as he remembered, and he set out to adapt it and abridge it, presenting the good parts, quote unquote, in a new annotated version, which he then later adapted into the 1987 movie. It is fair to say that outside of the study of Florinian literature and history in an academic setting, Goldman is single-handedly responsible for the success and enduring popularity of S. Morgenstern today. Except, of course, that he isn't. Except, of course, that all of this is a fabrication, that all of this is a fiction, that this is the frame for the Princess Bride novel, and none of it is true. There is no S. Morgenstern. There is no Country of Florin. There was no Buttercup or Wesley or Inigo Montoya or Fezzik or Humperdinck, despite the assertions contained within this novel that these are based on real historical events. There was no Dread Pirate Roberts. There was no Fire Swamp. There were no Cliffs of Insanity. The existence of Sicily and Australia and Los Angeles are clear fictional fabrications, as is the personal history presented to us in the introduction to the original edition of the novel. The real secret history of The Princess Bride comes from the the stories that Goldman told to his daughters when they were young. He had, despite the fictional frame laid around this story, no sons when they were children and were listening with rapt attention at his knee. Indeed, he originally tried to write The Princess Bride as a straight fairy tale in the Morgenstinian mode, but floundered when he got to chapter 2. He said that he wrote the first chapter about Buttercup, which ran for 20 pages in the space of just a couple of days. Then he wrote the second chapter, The Groom, about the man that she was going to marry, and managed a total of 4 pages before running completely dry and crashing into this same writer's block that had afflicted his prose writing throughout his career. Then he got the idea to wrap a fictional frame around this story and to write the abridged and annotated version. This is his quote. "And when that idea hit, everything changed. Tennessee Williams says that there are 3 or 4 days when you're writing a play that the piece opens itself to you, and the good parts of the play are all from those days. Well, The Princess Bride opened itself to me. I never had a writing experience like it. I went back and wrote the chapter about Bill Goldman being at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and it all just came out. I never felt as strongly connected emotionally to any writing of mine in my life. It was totally new and satisfying, and it came as such a contrast to the world I had been doing, to the work I had been doing in the films, that I wanted to be a novelist again." Next week, we are going to talk about that aforementioned 1987 movie adaptation of The Princess Bride, and we're going to talk about the actual story of The Princess Bride in greater depth. This week, we're going to focus on this audacious, this preposterous framing device and framing devices within framing devices that I have ever seen, that I have ever enjoyed, that I have ever loved as fiercely as I do. I love this book. I love Goldman's voice and wit and underlying intent, and I adore how completely he commits to the bit. I noticed that Soso Sundare here in the chat tonight was commenting on that opening section. I'm trying to scroll back to find the original comment. I fear that, yes. Aaron says, "Did anyone else's edition come with the lengthy forward by the author setting up the conceit of the story? Would be interested if one could just dive right into the story." That fictional frame is the story too. This entire account, that is not his wife. That is not his child. That is not the story of William Goldman's prior existence. This is not even the story of William Goldman falling in love with books. This is entirely fictional. This is a presented conceit. So in the course of tonight's discussion, we are going to have to very carefully disambiguate between 3 different authors. We are going to have to disambiguate between William Goldman in real life, the guy who sat down and wrote this abridged, annotated version of a fictional work. We're also going to have to talk about Bill Goldman, I suppose, the fictional author of the abridged work. And then we're going to have to talk about S. Morgenstern, the doubly fictional author of the original text, this original fairy tale that comes to us from the mysterious and mythical European country of Florin. I utterly love this conceit, and I can completely see why this conceit leaves many readers cold. A lot of people came to the book after seeing and enjoying and loving fiercely the movie and found the book to be snide and to be snarky and to be less celebratory, to be less authentic than they had wanted it to be, because the satirical frame around The Princess Bride is preserved with absolute and careful acuity. There is nothing in this book that would suggest to you that the Bill Goldman who was presented to us most powerfully in that opening chapter is in any way a fictional construct. Unless you go looking into the history of this book, that comes off, I think, as completely authentic, and that Bill Goldman is kind of a sad sack, right? He has externalized his sense of wonder and of justice, his sense of love and romance, most crucially, into this book that his father read him when he was a child. His fictional emigre from Florin father read to him when he was a child. And he was, of course, as we often are as adults, disappointed that our memories of our youthful inspirations did not live up to our original conceptions of those experiences, of those texts, of that art, right? He had that experience that we all have when we go back to something beloved and find out that actually it's pretty flawed and it's pretty incomplete and it isn't in any sense what we want it to be. So in the course of the next hour or so, what I want to do is look very carefully at these narrative layers. I want to celebrate this audacity. I want to celebrate these framing devices, but what I want to do most powerfully is look at what Goldman is actually doing. Why is he doing this? It isn't just an intellectual exercise, and it isn't just a comedic exercise. There is always a risk when you're talking about comedy that the analysis robs it of some of the magic, that very few jokes in the history of the world are improved by careful and painstaking analysis. But there is more going on here than just comedy. There's more going on here than just satire, more than just self-satire, certainly, and more than just a satire of the publishing industry, of pampered Columbia academics, of this reductive desire to recycle and reuse. It's fair to say, I think, that even in the 1973 original version of The Princess Bride, we can find resonances with, modern Hollywood and the desire to continually recycle existing ideas, trying to recover some fragment, some, I don't know, to pick a phrase at random, some 1/4 portion of a magic that inspired us in our youth. This is so smart, so acute, and very differently inclined than the movie adaptation. In the movie, we get a rap, of course. We get a framing device here, the telling of the story that is pretty close to at least an element from the opening chapter here in the novel version of The Princess Bride. But then we get the story with a certain commentary played pretty straight. And that story is almost identical. It's shocking, returning to this book after a few years, to see how painstakingly the dialogue in the movie replicates the dialogue in the novel. There are, of course, excisions. We don't get in the movie Inigo's extended flashback backstory. I've pulled a slide from that this evening just because it is so utterly fantastic. We don't similarly get Fezzik's backstory, but most of it is preserved rather beautifully. Even the partial, incomplete ambiguity of the end of the book is reframed, but is represented rather gorgeously. For all of that, The Princess Bride movie remains one of my favorite adaptations of all time, because it does something that very few adaptations even aspire toward, and even fewer manage to execute with this kind of dexterity, with this kind of insight, with this kind of compassion and empathy and human warmth. It manages to take the building blocks that in the novel William Goldman, the real world author, manages to put to a fairly satirical purpose, and follows through. It manages to, if you'll forgive the reuse of the phrase, commit to the bit. It manages to explore what is, at its heart, actually a rather touching and magical fairy tale love story. It does that gorgeously, and for all that it is structurally reminiscent, structurally reflective of the novel, for all that it lifts entire passages of dialogue verbatim from the pages of the novel, for all that it distills and explores and evokes and elicits the heart of William Goldman's text on the big screen, I should say. For all that it replicates this book, its effect is completely different. Its effect is nothing like as cynical. It's nothing like as damning. There is a reason that people of good heart generally love the Princess Bride movie and struggle a little bit more with the book. I'm going to try to, in the course of this session, frame that a little bit and try to explore what it is through close textual analysis, as we do here at Point North, try to explore what it is that William Goldman and, in effect, Bill Goldman are trying to do. And even S. Morgenstern. We get a few intrusions from S. Morgenstern into the flow of the narrative too, which I take a great deal of delight in. So the story itself, we'll wait until next week, but let's get started with our first slide here, looking at the beginning of this book. Let me see if I can share this with you. Yes, I can. Here we go. Oh, Father John pointing out in the chat here that it's interesting that Goldman wrote the script of the movie. Yes, this is an adaptation of his own prior work. This is so layered and smart and gorgeous, and it all begins here, right at the beginning of the novel. Who can know when his world is going to change? Who can tell before it happens that every prior experience, all the years, were a preparation for nothing? Picture this now. An all but illiterate old man struggling with an enemy tongue, an all but exhausted young boy fighting against sleep, and nothing between them but the words of another alien, painfully translated from native sounds to foreign. Who could suspect that in the morning a different child would wake? I remember for myself only trying to beat back fatigue. Even a week later, I was not aware of what had begun that night, the doors that were slamming shut while others slid into the clear. Perhaps I should have known at least something, but maybe not. Who can sense revelation in the wind? What happened was just this. I got hooked on the story. For the first time in my life, I became actively interested in a book. Me, the sports fanatic, me, the game freak, me, the only 10-year-old in Illinois with a hate-on for the alphabet, wanted to know what happened next. What became of beautiful Buttercup and poor Wesley and Inigo, the greatest swordsman in the history of the world? And how really strong was Fezzik? And were there limits to the cruelty of Vizzini, the devil's Sicilian? Each night my father read to me, chapter by chapter, always fighting to sound the words properly, to nail down the sense. And I lay there, eyes kind of closed, my body slowly beginning the long flow back to strength. It took, as I said, probably a month, and in that time he read The Princess Bride twice to me. Even when I was able to read myself, this book remained his. I would never have dreamed of opening it. I wanted his voice, his sounds. Later, years later even, sometimes I might say, "How about that duel on the cliff with Inigo and the man in black?" And my father would gruff and grumble and get the book and lick his thumb, turning pages till the mighty battle began. I loved that. Even today, that's how I summon back my father when the need arises. Slumped and squinting and halting over words, giving me Morgenstern's masterpiece as best he could. The Princess Bride belonged to my father. Everything else was mine. I struggle for all that Bill Goldman, the fictional author of this passage, is difficult, for all that he is a challenging personality within the frame of the novel. I struggle not to be moved by this. I struggle with the purity and the authenticity and the intensity of it. And what is going to happen through the rest of this book is that Goldman is going to first cast a shadow over this book. He is going to co-opt this memory as he is tempted by the attractive woman by the pool in LA. He is going to try, he's going to struggle desperately in a beautifully composed sequence of mostly dialogue to acquire a copy of this book for his son, for his, again, fictional son. He's going to struggle to get this book to try to elicit this feeling of fatherdom, this positive paternal influence, this paired struggle, these two people, these two souls engaged in valiant combat against the unknown, certainly, against the night, against fatigue and the desire for sleep, but also against a jaded view of the world. What Goldman is evoking here speaks most resonantly to me of Professor Tolkien's work in the On Fairy Stories essay, which you've almost certainly heard me discuss before because I talk about this essay all the time. If you haven't yet read it, go look up On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien. But in that essay, Tolkien lays out what a fairy story can do, what a fairy tale can do for us, what a good fairy tale must do for us. And one of the things that he alights upon in this analysis is this notion of recovery, that we become, through familiarity, through the grind of everyday life, jaded. We become less than we are. We become less human in the Hamlet sense, I suppose. You know, when Hamlet says with a certain amount of irony, I can say with sincerity, what a piece of work is man. We become jaded to the world, and we become jaded to the wonders of fiction. We become jaded to our own creativity and the creativity of others. And strong stories can restore that. They can gift us back some of that sense of wonder and sense of awe. And through that sense of wonder and sense of awe, revelation, epiphany. This is what Bill Goldman credits as a consequence of reading The Princess Bride, or more specifically, of having The Princess Bride read to him. What happened was just this: I got hooked on the story. This is the most powerful point of transition in Bill Goldman's life here, at least as he lays it out for us in the opening chapter of The Princess Bride. And it's one that I completely recognize. I remember that experience. It feels emotionally true, even if the details are factually false. And isn't that, in a sense, the heart of a story? Isn't that what a story is for? Isn't that how a story works its magic? It tells you a lie that is more true than the truth. And Bill Goldman is doing exactly that. Now, we might not love where he takes this. As I say, he will, first of all, cast a shadow over this book by trying to claim it as a token of good fathership in his ongoing diminishment, in his ongoing downward spiral into being a neglectful deadbeat father, in effect. You know, he's physically separated from his family at this point. He's in LA and they're in New York, but he's also clearly emotionally distant from his family too. And that only worsens as we get through the rest of the story. This, though, this is enormously powerful, enormously true, and curiously prophetic as we move through the rest of the book. Yeah. Karen says, I think I must have read it not long after it came out. I was maybe 11 or 12, so I was quite a naive reader, and the being read to scenario was close to my own experience. I completely agree, Karen. This does feel, as I say, very emotionally true to me, and this is proof, I think, of William Goldman, the real world author's skill. because he's not collapsing into a satirical pastiche. He's not giving us a parody of this scene. He's giving us something much more important. And you'll note, too, the connection here between Goldman's father and Morgenstern himself, both from Florin originally, both emigres to the United States, both struggling, in a sense, with the foreign tongue. Though, interestingly, Morgenstern does write The Princess Bride in English. Actually, Morgenstern writes The Princess Bride in both Florinian, I suppose, Florinish, and also in English for the American audience too. So thankfully there isn't another layer of narrative disambiguation that we have to pay close attention to as we move on. We don't now have to question what S. Morgenstern's original intent was in the original, language of Florin as he was writing this book. We get to take the English words, at least, on face value. So that is our introduction. We get a little more here, and we run through the story of Bill Goldman's life, the depressing and diminished story of Bill Goldman's life, up until the point that he decides that he wants to retackle this story. So he gives the book to his son. His son delights in the first chapter, falls out immediately in the second chapter, and Goldman, trying not to express hurt, trying not to express that curious and quintessential vulnerability that I think we all feel when we share something beloved with someone who just doesn't get it, right? That is a really frightening and difficult thing to do. It is very difficult to find something that you love and to say to someone that you love, someone with whom you were trying to foster a relationship, hey, this speaks to me and I think it would speak to you, and then have that rebuffed or have that fall apart. That's a really difficult thing to go through, and I love the fracture in Bill Goldman that we get there, and that leads him to write the abridged version. Let's move on to our next slide here. It came out pretty much as he said. They threatened to sue and I almost lost the job and some money, and I didn't make any friends in the industry, as those of us in showbiz call movies. But the abridgment got done, and you hold it in your hands. The good parts version. Why did I go through all that? Helen pressured me greatly to think about an answer. She felt it was important. Not that she knew necessarily, but that I know. Because you acted crackers, Willie boy, she said. You had me truly scared. So why? I never was worth beans at self-scrutiny. Everything I write is impulse. This feels right. That sounds wrong, like that. I can't analyze. Not my own actions, anyway. I know I don't expect this to change anybody else's life the way it altered mine. But take the title words, true love and high adventure. I believed in that once. I thought my life was going to follow that path, prayed that it would. Obviously, it didn't. But I don't think there's high adventure left anymore. Nobody takes out a sword nowadays and cries, "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die." And true love, you can forget about too. I don't know if I love anything truly anymore beyond the porterhouse at Peter Luger's and the cheese enchilada at El Parador's. Sorry about that, Helen. Anyway, here's the good parts version. S. Morgenstern wrote it, and my father read it to me, and now I give it to you. What you do with it will be of more than passing interest to us all. Bill Goldman here, the fictional narrator, giving us a powerful argument in favor for not storytelling, not narrative, right? Bill Goldman is not telling a story here. What he is doing is performing a hatchet job on an original story to fit better his purposes. What he is doing is adapting in the most reductive way. This isn't an engaging adaptation, right? When we talk about adaptation, when we talk about good adaptation, I should say, we generally talk about an author going into an existing story and distilling it down and then representing it in a new form, in a new medium, in a new way, finding new things within it. But Bill Goldman isn't doing that to the work of S. Morgenstern. What he is doing instead is cutting away everything that doesn't serve his specific and singular purpose. And that specific and singular purpose is an evocation of wonder, an evocation of awe, a restoration of that childlike belief that the world is just and populated with great impulses and huge emotions and titanic operatic conflicts, and that everyone deserving, lives happily ever after. I know I don't expect this to change anybody else's life the way it altered mine, he writes here at the beginning, and then caps this little introduction with, anyway, here's the good parts version. S. Morgenstern wrote it, and my father read it to me, and now I give it to you. What you do with it will be of more than passing interest to us all. What is his purpose here? Well, in a compelling sense, Bill Goldman is simply writing this for himself. He's writing this because he needs this book to exist. He needs this book to be a marker. He needs it to be a signpost. He needs it to be a guide to the kind of life that he believed he could live, to the kind of life, potentially at least, that he believes he still can live. but the world has failed to live up to his mythic expectations, to his fairy tale expectations. The world, sadly, doesn't run on the same rules as a fantasy novel. So we must pay close attention to that as we move through, because we're going to get some really interesting analysis of Morgenstern's writing as we move through the book. Goldman is going to be just critical of Morgenstern's writing. It is taken for read that Morgenstern is a genius. It is taken for read that The Princess Bride is a great classic knockout book, that everyone should read this book. And if it can but be distilled down to its good parts, as Goldman considers them, then it will still have that effect, or at least it still has the potential to have that effect. But Morgenstern's intent when writing The Princess Bride is clearly different from Goldman's takeaway from his experience of having this book read to him. This gap between author and reader is, of course, one that we return to frequently as we discuss and study the texts that we cover here on Point North Media. This is our house. This is where we live here at Point North Media. This evocation of wonder and awe, and also the analysis of a pre-existing text and wondering about narrative impulse and what a story means and how a story achieves its goals. This is what we do, which may, of course, be why I loved the novel of A Princess Bride long before I ever started doing this professionally, and continue to love it to this day. Let's pivot away from Goldman, then, from either Goldman, to the work of Morgenstern himself. We're going to get 2 slides here. Morgenstern's discussion of Florin, and then Goldman's interposed response to that discussion of Florin. Call out in the chat here what you see of the difference in voice between Goldman and Morgenstern as we move forward. The land of Florin was set between where Sweden and Germany would eventually settle. This was before Europe. In theory, it was ruled by King Lotheron and his second wife, the Queen. But in fact, the king was barely hanging on, could only rarely tell day from night, and basically spent his time in muttering. He was very old. Every organ in his body had long since betrayed him, and most of his important decisions regarding Florin had a certain arbitrary quality that bothered many of the leading citizens. Prince Humperdinck actually ran things. If there had been a Europe, he would have been the most powerful man in it. Even as it was, nobody within 1,000 miles wanted to mess with him. The Count was Prince Humperdinck's only confidant. His last name was Rugen, but no one needed to use it. He was only Count in the country, the title having been bestowed by the prince as a birthday present some years before, the happening taking place naturally at one of the Countess's parties. The Countess was considerably younger than her husband. All of her clothes came from Paris. This was after Paris. And she had superb taste. This was after taste too, but only just. And since it was such a new thing, and since the Countess was the only lady in all Florin to possess it, is it any wonder she was the leading hostess of the land? Eventually, her passion for fabric and face paint caused her to settle permanently in Paris, where she ran the only salon of international consequence. For now, she busied herself with simply sleeping on silk, eating on gold, and being the single most feared and admired woman in Florinese history. If she had figure faults, her clothes concealed them. If her face was less than divine, it was hard to tell once she got done applying substances. This was before glamour. But it hadn't been for ladies like the Countess. But if it hadn't been for ladies like the Countess, there would never have been a need for its invention. In sum, the Rugens were couple of the week in Florin, and had been for many years. Bill Goldman speculates in the surrounding material, in the frame of The Princess Bride, that Morgenstern's original intent here is not primarily narrative, it is primarily satirical, and it is a satire that is rooted in, we are told, real Florinese history. That is to say that these events actually happened. What they mean, the underlying motivations, may have been different, because who can record what people were actually thinking and what people actually wanted and why things happened the way that they happened. But we know that these events did in fact transpire in Florin at some time in the distant past. And, I'm sorry, at what time in the distant past was that? Because the land of Florin was set between where Sweden and Germany would eventually settle. This was before Europe. All of her clothes came from Paris. This was after Paris. And she had superb taste. This was after taste too, but only just. This was before glamour, but if it hadn't been for ladies like the Countess, there would never have been a need for its invention. Now, even as you're reading this for the first time, I think our desire, my desire certainly, is to try to fit this into a complete and comprehensive and comprehensible schema. We want to look at this and figure out the where and the when of it. And we have been conditioned to do exactly that by fantasy authors for the last 150 years, for the writers of fairy tales for 150 years. Ever since we transitioned away from that fairy tale tradition of once upon a time or over 7 hills and beyond 7 forests, right? Once we transitioned out of that as an introductory mode for fairy tales and we started telling real fantasy stories about secondary worlds with authentic world building and the investment of belief and creativity in their foundations, we've moved away from this vague sense of the past. But Morgenstern hasn't. Morgenstern is in fact embracing this. He is leaning into this, and he is doing so with an acute and parenthetically satirical eye. Morgenstern's comments on his own book, and this is a full credit to William Goldman, the real author of this book, as opposed to Bill Goldman, the in-fiction author of this book. Morgenstern's critique of his own work is at least as astute, and oftentimes far more astute, than Bill Goldman's critique of his work. These little parentheticals do exactly what they're supposed to do. So Sundar is saying here in the chat, it's great that Morgenstern is so heavily defended by the academics in this fictional world, since Goldman can use the satire of that group and undercut them at the same time. Completely right. There's the great throwaway disparaging comment. In fact, did I pull that on the next slide? I may have pulled that on the next slide. Let me see here. I think I did. Let's move into the next slide, which is continuing on from that last passage. This is Goldman's first real interposed parenthetical response. This is me. All abridging remarks and other comments will be in red, so you'll know. When I said at the start that I'd never read this book, that's true. My father read it to me, and I just quick skimmed along, crossing out whole sections when I did the abridging, leaving everything just as it was in the original Morgenstern. This chapter is totally intact. My intrusion here is because of the way Morgenstern uses parentheses. The copy editor at Harcourt kept filling the margins of the galley proofs with questions. How can it be before Europe, but after Paris? And how is it possible this happens before glamour, when glamour is an ancient concept? See glamour in the Oxford English Dictionary, and eventually, I am going crazy. What am I to make of these parentheses? When does this book take place? I don't understand anything. Help! Denise, the copy editor, has done all my books since Boys and Girls Together, and she'd never been as emotional in the margins with me before. I couldn't help her. Either Morgenstern meant them seriously or he didn't. Or maybe he meant some of them seriously and some others he didn't, but he never said which were the seriously ones. Or maybe it was the author's way of telling the reader stylistically that this isn't real, it never happened. That's what I think, in spite of the fact that if you read back into Florini's history, it did happen. The facts, anyway. No one can say about the actual motivations. All I can suggest to you is, if the parentheses bug you, don't read them. So here we have William Goldman writing and attributing to Bill Goldman a critique of the works of S. Morgenstern, the satirical works of S. Morgenstern, which Bill Goldman is apparently ill-equipped to understand, but which William Goldman has a complete mastery over. This is how this novel works. This is why this novel opens like a puzzle box upon very close scrutiny. I do want to pay close attention to that first passage too. All abridging remarks and other comments will be in red, so you'll know. He's just identifying the fact that he's going to make a habit of these intrusions. When I said at the start that I'd never read this book, that's true. My father read it to me, and I just quick skimmed along, crossing out whole sections when I did the abridging, leaving everything just as it was in the original Morgenstern. So he hasn't changed any of the actual prose that comes from the Morgenstern original. He has just truncated. He hasn't adapted so much as he has, as he says here, abridged. He has just taken things out. And when he takes things out, particularly significant chunks of prose, he'll leave us a little note to let us know that he did it. My query here is with this notion of the original Morgenstern. Leaving everything just as it was in the original Morgenstern is an ambiguous phrase, because he's meaning, of course, the prose that remains that is credited to Morgenstern, that is to say, the prose that is not offset in red or offset in italics, depending on your version of the book, that is authentic. I haven't gone in and changed it. I haven't changed Humperdinck's name or made the silly joke about Buttercup calling her horse. None of that is me. All of that is authentically Morgensternian. But when he's talking about the original Morgenstern, he's not just talking about the prose, he's also talking about the story. These hard cuts are a consequence of the editing process that his father went through as he was reading the book to the young Bill Goldman in the first place. And here we see a fascinating tension between the prose of the book and the story of the book. And this is something that we rarely, I think, get the opportunity to delve into, because modern novels, in the postmodern era, modern novels, when they are reflexive about novels. That is to say that the entirety of the novel, the form and the structure and the prose and the narrative, the style, the design, the layout, the typography, every detail of the novel is reflexive about novels. It is engaged in an internal discourse with the concept of the novel. And the same is true for movies and for music and for TV shows and for every form of art. What we rarely do is disambiguate the medium and the message. We rarely look at a novel that draws a clear distance between the artifact that you are holding in your hand, the printed words on the page, and the story that is communicated by those words. This is something far more ambitious. What Goldman is trying to do here is to touch the mythic. He is aspiring towards something great and something grand, but he's doing it in the most literally reductive way that he possibly can. It is possible for Bill Goldman to do as S. Morgenstern did and to write a great fairy tale, to write a new story that would enkindle that same sense of awe and wonder as The Princess Bride originally did in the young Bill Goldman. But he's not interested in doing that because he's not actually interested in wonder and awe and restoration and recovery in the abstract. He's interested in these things in the specific. He doesn't want awe, he wants that awe. He doesn't want to love books, he wants to love books the way that The Princess Bride made him love books. He wants this artifact of his past, an artifact which never really existed. To the extent that it ever existed, it existed solely within the mind of his father and went no further. I'm sorry to say that I didn't actually pull the passage, and now I don't even remember where the passage is, when he's snide about Columbian academics, basically, when he's talking about the analysis of Morgenstern's works in an academic context and is snide about Columbian academics. He was, of course, a Columbian academic. That is where he got his MA. What Bill Goldman is talking about there is, in a sense, William Goldman, right? You can't do what William Goldman does without a mastery of this kind of storytelling, and it is exactly that mastery of which Bill Goldman seems to be completely suspicious. I love the interplay between these layers of the narrative. Let me see here. As I'm scrolling back through the chat, I'm paying almost no attention to the chat here, which is a terrible thing. This is, I've got so much material to cover, and I'm already more than halfway. Okay, you guys, if you have questions in the chat, drop them into the questions box, because I'm afraid you guys are chatty and I just can't keep up. Let's move on. Let's get, in fact, into the story itself. So we are introduced to Florin. We are introduced to our setting, our locale here for the first arc of this story. We are most powerfully introduced to Buttercup, and we get this brilliantly analytical deconstruction by Morgenstern. This is a trick that he repeats. Morgenstern, again, the fictional voice here. This is a trick that Morgenstern repeats, 8 times, maybe 10 times throughout the course of the book, breaking down the great lists of history. Who were the most beautiful women in history? What were the hottest kisses? And so on and so forth. He does this repeatedly through the course of the book, giving that analytical, satirical intent its full measure, giving it its full reign here in the prose. Because, of course, once you put things on a list, you are depriving them of their magic. You are depriving them of their wonder. You are pinning these butterflies to the corkboard and not letting them live, not letting them breathe. So I love that just as a device. That is a very acute piece of satire from William Goldman here about exactly the kind of deconstruction that he is parodying here. I adore that. Again, exactly the kind of deconstruction that we do here at Point North Media. I don't know about you guys, I feel a little attacked, but it's a loving attack, and I'm very enthralled and enchanted by the execution here. Let's get right into it, though, by looking at the character of Buttercup herself. Buttercup has this ongoing relationship, this tempestuous relationship with the farm boy, Wesley. She has this disinterest in the boys in the village, even when the mere existence of boys in the village and the enchantment of the boys in the village with her, a relationship in which she has played no part at all and has no interest whatsoever. When this relationship kind of robs her of her social standing with the other girls in the village, she still doesn't care. It is only the appearance of the Count and the Countess at the farm and Wesley's reveal, right? This moment when Buttercup realizes that the Countess is sexually interested in Wesley, that Wesley is a fine figure of a man, that he has the great virtue of being unbearably hot. This is when Buttercup becomes first jealous and then, in the middle of the night, crosses to Wesley's shack to proclaim her love. "I love you," Buttercup said. "I know this must come as something of a surprise, since all I've ever done is scorn and degrade you and taunt you, but I've loved you for several hours now and every second more. I thought an hour ago that I loved you more than any woman has ever loved a man, but a half hour after that I knew that what I felt before was nothing compared to what I felt then. But 10 minutes after that, I understood that my previous love was a puddle compared to the high seas before a storm. Your eyes are like that. Did you know? Well, they are. How many minutes ago was I? 20? Had I brought my feelings up to then? It doesn't matter. Buttercup still could not look at him. The sun was rising behind her now. She could feel the heat on her back, and it gave her courage. I love you so much more now than 20 minutes ago that there cannot be comparison. I love you so much more now than when you opened your hovel door. There cannot be comparison. There is no room in my body for anything but you. My arms love you. My ears adore you. My knees shake with blind affection. My mind begs you to ask it something so it can obey. Do you want me to follow you for the rest of your days? I will do that. Do you want me to crawl? I will crawl. I will be quiet for you, or sing for you, or if you are hungry, let me bring you food, or if you have thirst and nothing will quench it but Arabian wine, I will go to Araby, even though it is across the world, and bring a bottle back for your lunch. Anything there is that I can do for you, I will do for you. Anything there is that I cannot do, I will learn to do. I know I cannot compete with the Countess in skills or wisdom or appeal, and I saw the way she looked at you, and I saw the way you looked at her. But remember, please, that she is old and has other interests. Well, I am 17, and for me there is only you, dearest Wesley. I've never called you that before, have I? Wesley, 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 darling Wesley, adored Wesley, sweet, perfect Wesley, whisper that I have a chance to win your love. And with that, she dared the bravest thing she'd ever done. She looked right into his eyes. He closed the door in her face, without a word. Without a word. This is so brilliant. This is so very, very good. And it is so layered in its goodness that I have a hard time encapsulating it. Layer the first. This is a brilliant assessment of young love. This is a brilliant assessment of that adolescent rush of hormones, love at first sight, now or never, all or nothing kind of love. This is immature love represented as beautifully as any episode of The OC or Gossip Girl that you ever care to mention. Layer the second. This is a brilliant parody of that kind of adolescent love. It is both true and authentic for Buttercup, and yet also so true and authentic for Buttercup that it works as satire. We, the adult audience, can see what is happening here. We can see this consistent rush into this reckless and heedless rush into excess, this desire to embrace excess and understand it for what it is. Layer the third. It is also perfectly representative of the great secret power in The Princess Bride. And I'm really going to put a large pin in this because we're going to talk about it extensively next week when we deconstruct the actual plot of The Princess Bride. But hey, you guys, what is The Princess Bride about? The Princess Bride as a core narrative, not the Morgenstern critique, not the Goldman critique, not the existence of the book itself, but the core narrative is about one thing. It is about the power of stories. And here we see Buttercup telling herself the story of being in love with Wesley. And we're coming in very late here. I could have pulled the preceding 3 pages and done the whole piece here, and it would have been wonderful. But obviously, to be somewhat respectful of your time and mine, I had to pull just the last part here. This is a perfect example of someone narrativizing themselves into a state, narrativizing themselves into a condition, narrativizing themselves into an experience, into something which may actually be true, right? What Buttercup is doing here by telling herself and Wesley the story of how in love with Wesley she is, how infeasibly, excessively, ludicrously in love with Wesley she is, what she is doing right here is exactly the same thing as Bill Goldman trying to recover The Princess Bride in the first place. Again, not the actual book, The Princess Bride, but that juvenile experience of The Princess Bride. She is looking for a world that is wide and populated with magic and miracles and true love. I'm resisting the urge to quote the movie. I'm resisting it, you guys. I can't hold out forever. Next week, there are going to be multiple quotes, but I'm trying my best here. But true love, he said, carefully enunciating that R. And that's exactly what Bill Goldman is doing in trying to recover his experience of The Princess Bride in the first place. This is what the story is all about. The chat is just gorgeous tonight. It's Romeo and Juliet all over again, says Heroes and Bards. Very Romeo and Juliet, confirms Becca Eller. And yes, in part. I mean, we can definitely see that, right? Yes, good. Sosa Sunder says, Buttercup and Farm Boy were such a lovely nascent dom-sub relationship. Shame they had to damsel her. I would love a version of this of Buttercup versus the Countess. Yes, I mean, Buttercup versus the Countess is great. That line is so good. I know I cannot compete with the Countess in skills or wisdom or appeal, and I saw the way she looked at you, and I saw the way you looked at her. But remember, please, that she is old and has other interests, and I am 17, and for me, there is only you. These are the two things that I have going for me. Youth and a very specific focus, Wesley, like a really, like a suspicious, like a worryingly, a troublingly specific focus. This is what makes me perfect girlfriend material. Ta-da! And then he closed the door in her face without a word, without a word. And S. Morgenstern has an unconquerable mastery of this kind of narrative pacing. I've talked about this kind of narrative pacing, in fact, a couple times over the course of the last year, because I found myself running into the works of J.K. Rowling, who has a very similar tendency in her prose, and also the works of Neil Gaiman, particularly with regard to American Gods, where he too does exactly this kind of thing, where he allows the narrative to pick up pace and become larger and faster and grander and more, and then punctures it. Gives us a very short sentence. You know, if you read American Gods along with me, and Shadow said nothing, right? We keep bringing back these expansive tracts of prose to these very simple moments of action. He closed the door in her face without a word, without a word. Unfortunately, this doesn't work out. Spoilers for The Princess Bride, I guess. I'm sorry. It turns out that Wesley has in fact been saying that he loves Buttercup all along, that every time he has said his trademark catchphrase, "As you wish," he has been telling her that he loves her. But he can't marry her because he is a simple farm boy and she is Buttercup, so he has to go off to sea, actually go off to the Americas to try and find his fortune, because fortunes... I love that very much. When we get that line about him going off to America to find his fortune, this was after the founding of America and a long time after the founding of fortunes. It's good. Like, Morgenstern is funny. Morgenstern works for me. I don't know. Unfortunately, Wesley doesn't make it back. Wesley is taken by the dread pirate Roberts, and this is the conclusion of Buttercup's first act here in the story. She stayed there many days. At first, her parents tried to lure her, but she would not have it. They took to leaving food outside her room, and she took bits and shreds, enough to stay alive. There was never noise inside, no wailing, no bitter sounds. And when she at last came out, her eyes were dry. Her parents stared up from their silent breakfast at her. They both started to rise, but she put a hand out, stopped them. "I can care for myself, please." And she set about getting some food. They watched her closely. In point of fact, she had never looked as well. She had entered her room as just an impossibly lovely girl. The woman who emerged was a trifle thinner, a great deal wiser, an ocean sadder. This one understood the nature of pain, and beneath the glory of her features there was character and a sure knowledge of suffering. She was 18. She was the most beautiful woman in 100 years. She didn't seem to care. "You're all right?" her mother asked. Buttercup sipped her cocoa. "Fine," she said. "You're sure?" her father wondered. "Yes," Buttercup replied. There was a very long pause. "But I must never love again." She never did. This is brilliant fairy tale storytelling. Just superficially, this is brilliant fairy tale storytelling, right? The complexity and the authenticity, the veracity of the Morgenstern core text here pretty consistently works for me. There are a few moments when it deviates out, and I'm not even talking about the edits that are made by Bill Goldman, like the things that Bill Goldman finds objectionable. There are a few moments when the satire finds itself in tension with, if not in outright conflict with, the actual core fairy tale story. But when those two things are aligned, they are aligned beautifully. And of course, as a lover of the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, this is enormously evocative to me. You know, sadness from which their beauty chiefly came, this is fundamental to the notion of beauty in Middle-earth. This is fundamental to the Ainulindale, to the third theme of the Ainulindale, the song that is sung at the beginning of creation in J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium, to the elves in general, right? The story of Aragorn and Arwen is anchored in this idea that tragedy brings great beauty, that tragedy can give character, can grant. This one understood the nature of pain, and beneath the glory of her features there was character and a sure knowledge of suffering. This is absolutely foundational to the assertion in the next line. She was 18, she was the most beautiful woman in 100 years, she didn't seem to care. All of these ideas absolutely complicit with one another. All of these ideas pulling together. Heroes and bards calling out here. Something about Buttercup here calls to mind Éowyn. Éowyn, absolutely. Éowyn has pretty comprehensively had a Buttercup experience, right? In The Lord of the Rings. You're absolutely right. That's gorgeous. Okay, we've got 4 more slides and 10 more minutes. Let's see what we can do here. This is the point at which I'm basically going to break, with the exception of one brief visit with Inigo Montoya and his backstory in just a couple of slides' time. I'm pretty much going to break from the story now because, as I say, we're going to talk about the story next week. What I want to pay attention to here as we move through the rest of the book, the vast bulk of the book, is the relationship between Morgenstern and Goldman. Let's actually move into Morgenstern excising pretty much all of Chapter 2. This is my first major excision. Chapter 1, The Bride, is almost in its entirety about the bride. Chapter 2, The Groom, only picks up Prince Humperdinck in the last few pages. This chapter is where my son Jason stopped reading, and there is simply no way of blaming him. For what Morgenstern has done is open the chapter with 66 pages of Florinese history. More accurately, it is the history of the Florinese crown. Dreary? Not to be believed. Why would a master of narrative stop his narrative dead before it has much chance to begin generating? No known answer. All I can guess is that for Morgenstern, the real narrative was not Buttercup and the remarkable things she endures, but rather the history of the monarchy and other such stuff. When this version comes out, I expect every Florinese scholar alive to slaughter me. Columbia University has not only the leading Florinese experts in America, but also direct ties to the New York Times Book Review. I can't help that, and I only hope they understand my intentions here are in no way meant to be destructive of Morgenstern's vision. So I apologize for misattributing the reference to Columbia earlier in tonight's session. Here it is. I knew that I'd pulled this slide. Here it is. So he cuts the text, first of all, a little real-world satire here, a little Goldman on Goldman satire here, because this is, as I mentioned earlier, the point at which the real-world William Goldman found himself struggling. He found himself becalmed as he was trying to write the original text of The Princess Bride. He launched into Chapter 2, realized he had very little to say, and stalled out. So this satire here, the fact that he has cut 66 pages of discussion of the Florinese monarchy, is kind of a stab at himself, or at least a wry aside about himself. What we really get, though, is an interaction between Bill Goldman, the abridger, I suppose I don't even necessarily want to call him an adapter at this point, and Morgenstern himself. Why would a master of narrative stop his narrative dead before it has much chance to begin generating? No known answer. Okay, let's look at that assertion. Morgenstern is a master of narrative. He is the greatest. Look at this book. We've had 20 pages of Buttercup, which is fantastic. Well, and then 66 pages of history of Florin. But he's a master. I mean, that's clear. That's unassailable. No one is going to contest Morgenstern's position within the literary firmament. Certainly not me. Certainly not Bill Goldman, who loves this book so much that I am cutting it to bits. If you count up the excisions that he makes, he cuts at least a half of the book. Like, at least a half of the final text of The Princess Bride is gone in the Goldman cut. Why would a master of narrative stop his narrative dead before it has much chance to begin generating? No known answer. All I can guess is that for Morgenstern, the real narrative was not Buttercup and the remarkable things she endures, but rather the history of the monarchy and other such stuff. So what Morgenstern is really interested in is the real or semi-real or quasi-real history of his homeland, his history of Florin. He is himself Florinese. He's telling a story about the actual history of his country, a fictionalized account, certainly, but the actual history of his country. But Goldman has no interest in that. He cuts all of this out. And he cuts it out because he wants to focus on Buttercup, which Morgenstern is, at least by Goldman's own assertion, less interested in. Then we get to the last line, the ironic last line here. Columbia University has not only the leading Florinese experts in America, but also direct ties to the New York Times Book Review. The idea that literary success is a product of academic and critical support is charmingly outdated. It wasn't true even in 1973, and it sure as hell isn't true today, but it is charmingly outdated, and it is the kind of thing that Bill Goldman would absolutely believe, by the way. I can't help that. I can only hope they understand my intentions here are in no way meant to be destructive of Morgenstern's vision. What was Morgenstern's vision? Oh, 66 pages of the history of Florin. What have you done to that vision? Oh, you've cut it entirely. In what sense is it not supposed to be destructive? Here we see that Bill Goldman was telling us the absolute truth back at the beginning of the book. He has no talent for self-scrutiny. He has no way of understanding his own motivations or even potentially his own actions. He doesn't know why he is doing this. Luckily, Bill Goldman is not the last authorial voice who will touch this book. Real-life William Goldman is extraordinarily skilled at drawing out the pathos of this this wretched and self-obsessed little man, this weak little man who is striving to restore some semblance of his own innocence and youth in this vampiric and narcissistic way at the expense of the creative endeavor of another man, a man from his inherited homeland, a man who shared a birthplace with his own father. Goldman will take the hatchet freely to Morgenstern's work that is not known now, right? We remember how difficult it is for him to find a copy of The Princess Bride in the first place. No one knows this book. And Goldman is taking a hatchet to it, not to preserve Morgenstern's vision, not to speak in support of Morgenstern's vision, not to illuminate that vision, but rather to feed vampirically and parasitically off of that vision in order to present the thing that he needs. Not even present. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about the critical or commercial success of this book. He wants this book. If there is one copy of this book that is published and he has it on his shelf, there is a sense in which Bill Goldman will be completely pleased with that outcome. Let's move quickly on to the excising of the packing scenes, just to reiterate this point. Me again. Of all the cuts in this version, I feel most justified in making this one. Just as the chapters on whaling in Moby Dick can be omitted by all but the most punishment-loving readers, so the packing scenes that Morgenstern details here are really best left alone. That's what happens for the next 56.5 pages of The Princess Bride. Packing. I include unpacking scenes in the same category. What happens is just this. Queen Bella packs most of her wardrobe, 11 pages, and travels to Gilder, 2 pages. In Gilder, she unpacks, 5 pages, then tenders the invitation to Princess Nerina, 1 page. Princess Nerina accepts, 1 page. Then Princess Nerina packs all of her clothes and hats, 23 pages, and together the princess and the queen travel back to Florin for the annual celebration of the founding of Florin City. 1 page. They reach King Lotharon's castle, where Princess Nerina is shown her quarters, half a page, and unpacks all the same clothes and hats we've just seen her pack 1.5 pages before, 12 pages. It's a baffling passage. I spoke to Professor Bongiorno of Columbia University, the head of their Florinese department, and he said that this was the most deliciously satiric chapter in the entire book. Morgenstern's point, apparently, being simply to show that although Florin considered itself vastly more civilized than Gilder, Gilder was in fact the far more sophisticated country, as indicated by the superiority in number and quality of the ladies' clothes. I'm not about to argue with the fool professor, but if you ever have a really unbreakable case of insomnia, do yourself a favor and start reading chapter 3 of the uncut version. It's all there. What is the purpose of Morgenstern's text? Well, actually, Professor Bongiorno manages to express at least a potentially valid interpretation of Morgenstern's story here, and it is completely discounted by Goldman, by a man who heralds this as the best book ever, as his favorite book, as the most influential book he has ever read, and the work of an unalloyed genius. He can't, in the course of this book, both preserve Morgenstern's genius and give this personal and reductive account of the book. I am really running out of time. Aaron is saying here in the chat. Aaron is saying here in the chat, to be fair, hats are super hard to pack and travel when they get complex, especially in those days. Which days are those, Aaron? Before Europe, but after Paris? Which days were those occurring in? And Seastar says, hey, I quite like the whale-related parts of Moby Dick. No, this is completely fair too, right? The whale-related parts of Moby Dick, as impenetrable and unceasing as they may seem, are in large part the point of the book. Goldman is doing to Moby Dick exactly what he is doing to Morgenstern's Princess Bride, right? He is failing to see the intent of the original author, and he is cherry-picking his favorite moments from the book and putting together what he's basically putting together is a YouTube supercut of this novel, right? He's not trying to preserve any narrative cohesion. He's not trying to preserve any greater structural integrity or sense. And God knows he's disinterested in the author's original vision. Instead, he wants one particular outcome. He wants to see all the times that Owen Wilson says, wow, or he wants to see all the times that Cap punches someone in the Marvel movies, or whatever supercut it is that you're watching, all the Aaron Sorkin dialogue from The West Wing, where they're walking and talking down corridors. I'm thinking of Aaron Sorkin a lot today because of William Goldman's association with A Few Good Men. He was a consultant on A Few Good Men and apparently worked pretty closely with Aaron Sorkin in the production of the movie version of A Few Good Men after Sorkin had blown the doors off the theater world with his original script. It's pretty astonishing stuff to think of the two of these men working together, because I can completely see how well they would work together. I kind of wish I could have been a fly on the wall during some conversations, though, I'm not going to lie. All right. Let's keep pushing on. I do want to talk about Inigo's flashback story, because we're not going to get a chance to talk about this next week. We cut from the movie version Inigo's flashback story and Fezzik's flashback story, and That's the right choice. It's the right choice to cut these extended and weighty, significant flashbacks for the movie because there just isn't space for them. So we get severely curtailed and reduced and abridged, but far more focused versions of them. But I need to take the opportunity to talk about how brilliant Inigo is in this book. And I'm going to pronounce this character's name Yesti because that is just how I read it the first time that I read the book. I have no idea if that's correct. I have no idea if there's an alternate pronunciation that I should be using. But for some reason, when I first read this book, it stuck with me as Yesti, which feels very flat and prosaic, and I don't love it. So if it's supposed to be Yesta or just yeast or I don't know, something, but I'm going to pronounce it Yesti. So if that's incorrect, if that doesn't jibe with your reading of this name, then forgive me for that. Madness, said Yesti. You have spent 10 entire years just learning to fence? No, not just learning to fence, Inigo answered. I did many other things as well. Tell me. Well, Inigo began, 10 years is what? About 3,600 days, and that's about, I figured this out once, so I remember pretty well, about 86,000 hours. Well, I always made it a point to get 4 hours of sleep per night. That's 14,000 hours right there, leaving me perhaps 72,000 hours to account for. You slept. I'm with you. What else? Well, I squeezed rocks. I'm sorry, my hearing sometimes fails me. It sounded like you said you squeezed rocks. To make my wrists strong, so I could control the sword. Rocks like apples, that size. I would squeeze them in each hand for perhaps 2 hours a day. And I would spend another 2 hours a day in skipping and dodging and moving quickly so that my feet would be able to get me into position to deliver properly the thrust of the sword. That's another 14,000 hours. I'm down to 58,000 now. Well, I always sprinted 2 hours each day as fast as I could, so my legs, as well as being quick, would also be strong, and that gets me down to about 50,000 hours. Yeasty examined the young man before him. Blade thin, 6 feet in height, straight as a sapling, bright-eyed, taut, even motionless, he seemed whippet quick. And these last 50,000 hours, they have been spent studying the sword. Inigo nodded. Where? Wherever I could find a master. Venice, Bruges, Budapest. I could have taught you here. True, but you care for me. You would not have been ruthless. You would have said, excellent parry, Inigo. That's enough for one day. Let's have supper. That does sound like me, Yesti admitted. I love this passage, and it does exactly, this is playing into exactly that same inclination from Morgenstern that we've seen before, right? That strict accounting, that ordering in lists, that taxonomy of beauty or of kisses or of wonders or of jealousy brilliantly. And the fantastic false history of jealousy that we get early in the book is one of my favorite things. This fits into that academic predisposition, which we have freely attributed to Morgenstern in the rest of the book, and yet it works beautifully for the character to look at how effortless this character dialogue is, and then contrast this effortless character dialogue with the extremely forced character dialogue that we get in the Goldman parts, particularly in that opening chapter, that large introductory section that we get in the book, where the dialogue never feels authentic. It certainly never feels this authentic. That does sound like me, Yesti admitted, or Yeast admitted, I suppose. That is completely naturalistic dialogue. Now, it works, again, in a number of different ways, right? A, it delivers the joke. The joke is great. True, but you care for me. You would not have been ruthless. You would have said, excellent parry, and you go, now that's enough for one day. Let's have supper. That does sound like me. Like, good solid joke, good comedic timing, well done. It works as a joke. It also works as a character piece. This shows the intimacy between these two men, this long and well-established and challenged but never dominated intimacy between these two men. It's exactly what it should be. And this entire section plays into this Morgensternian desire to categorize, this desire to build a taxonomy, to build a hierarchical list of all of everything, I suppose. The brilliance of Inigo's engagement with math here just makes me absolutely thrilled. Let's take a look here to good. Oh, pronunciation is weird. Oh, Asa is saying yeast is the pronunciation. It could be, yes. Yes, that's absolutely. This is just one of those things, when you read a book when you're a kid and you internalize the pronunciations in a way that can never be fully shaken from you. It just always happens. I'm sure there are a million others that I'm guilty of too. I had to train myself out of mispronouncing a number of Tolkienian names through the study of The Lord of the Rings. Luckily, I had the audiobooks to help guide me. I had Rod Inglis, right, to do that. Good. Okay, let's take a look here at the next slide. I guess I have 2 more slides, not 1 more. Okay. I just love this. This is just by means of an anecdote here about The Princess Bride. I'm now actually officially over time, so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, but I can't leave without talking about this. So this begins with a parenthetical intrusion from Morgenstern, which is interrupted by a pseudo-parenthetical intrusion from Bill Goldman. At this point in the story, my wife wants it known that she feels violently cheated not being allowed the scene of reconciliation on the ravine floor between the lovers. My reply to her: this is me, and I'm not trying to be confusing, but the above paragraph that I'm cutting into now is verbatim Morgenstern. He was continually referring to his wife in the unabridged book, saying that she loved the next section, or she thought that all in all the book was extraordinarily brilliant. Mrs. Morgenstern was rarely anything but supportive to her husband, unlike some wives I could mention. Sorry about that, Helen. But here's the thing. I got rid of almost all the intrusions when he told us what she thought. I didn't think the device added a whole lot, and besides, he was always complimenting himself through her, and today we know that hyping something too much does more harm than good, as any defeated political candidate will tell you when he pays his television bills. The thing of it is this. I left this particular reference in because for once, I totally happen to agree with Mrs. Morgenstern. I think it was unfair not to show the reunion. So I wrote one of my own, where what I felt Buttercup and Wesley might have said, but Hiram, my editor, felt that made me just as unfair as Morgenstern here. If you're going to abridge a book in the author's own words, you can't go around sticking your own in. That was Hiram's point, and we really went round and round arguing over, I guess, a period of a month in person, through letters, on the phone. Finally, we compromised to this extent. This, what you're reading in the black print, is strict Morgenstern, verbatim. Cut, yes. Changed, no. But I got Hiram to agree that Harcourt would at least print up my scene. It's all of 3 pages, big deal. And if any of you want to see what it came out like, drop a note or postcard to Hiram Hayden at Harcourt Brace Yovanovich, 757 3rd Avenue, New York City, and just mention you'd like the reunion scene. Don't forget to include your return address. You'd be stunned at how many people send in for things and don't put the return address down. First off, the joke here. First off, the William Goldman joke about the complete insensibility of Bill Goldman. Interrupting a personal reference in order to make a personal reference. Interrupting a parenthetical aside in order to insert your own parenthetical aside is absurd, is ridiculous, is actually very funny. It is also the case that Bill Goldman has, of course, been hyping up both Morgenstern and himself repeatedly throughout the course of the whole book. The reason that he has cut the comments attributed to Mrs. Morgenstern is clearly more to do with his wife Helen than it is to do with their effect on the final text. If he was genuinely concerned about the level of hype associated with The Princess Bride, he probably wouldn't have written that entire introduction in the first place, and he certainly wouldn't have billed this as a good bits abridgment of Morgenstern's original text. But here's the amazing thing. Hiram Hayden was William Goldman's publisher, was William Goldman's editor. In fact, if you pay close attention to the very front of your copy of The Princess Bride, you will notice that this book is dedicated to Hiram Hayden because Hiram Hayden, sad to say, died in 1973. He died just before the publication of this book. What is amazing is that the address given in the book is for William Goldman's real-life editor, at his real-life publisher, at their real-life office in New York City. And believe it or not, people did actually write to the publishing house in order to get the deleted scene. There is no deleted scene, or if there is a deleted scene, it has never been made available. The response to readers' letters was a letter in return explaining the legal problems associated with the scene, placing the blame for the publisher's inability to distribute the scene to the brilliantly named character Kermit Shog. Because of Kermit Shog, I can't give you the fantastic 3-page reunion scene that I wrote, says William Goldman in a letter to the reader of the original book, I suppose. It was revised in 1978 to mention a possible sequel to The Princess Bride entitled Buttercup's Baby. It was again revised in 1987 after the movie. It was revised in 1998 for the 25th anniversary edition and in 2003 for the 30th anniversary edition. Unfortunately, the Harcourt website is now no longer available. That website page where you could ultimately, after the 30th edition was released, they said that you could just email them and ask for the reunion scene, and they would send you, not the reunion scene, but at that point they would send you the 3 existing letters that had been written in that point. They would just email them to you. That site no longer exists. And I tried today using the Internet Archive, using the Wayback Machine to go and poke the CGI script on that page just to see if I could get an automated response. And I'm sorry to say that I did not. You can find the letters around online. This is one of the most gorgeously realized alternate reality jokes that I have maybe ever seen. Including it in the novel at all is incredibly ballsy. It is incredibly audacious. It is borderline stupid. But then Goldman redeems it, as he redeems so many things, by following through on it beautifully, by writing this grudging and sulky letter about why he can't give you the reunion scene. So strong, so good, so on point. Congratulations, Mr. Goldman. Yeah, I love that. So Sundar is saying here, please, sir, I would like for you to refer me to this Wesley Cup fanfic mentioned in the book. Yes, exactly. I absolutely love that. It's just wonderful. Yeah. Oh, this is great. Angela Lurie has actually copied the link here in the chat for As You Wish, the what would you call that? The autobiographical account of the filming of The Princess Bride, written by Carrie Ellis. I'm never sure how hard you're supposed to hit that W in his name. Presumably, I'm going to find out because I actually bought that book today, and I'm going to read it before next week's session. So I will, if nothing else, learn from the man himself how to pronounce his name. Pronunciations are hard, as we've said before. Let's take just a couple more minutes to talk here about the very end of the book. I really want to talk about the last part of the book. And this, again, is we're kind of unpeeling the nested layers here. And they lived happily ever after, my father said. Wow, I said. He looked at me. You're not pleased? No, it's just, it came so quick, the ending. It surprised me. I thought there'd be a little more, is all. I mean, was the pirate ship waiting, or was that just a rumor, like it said? Complained to Mr. Morgenstern, and they lived happily ever after is how it ends. The truth was, my father was fibbing. I spent my whole life thinking it ended that way, up until I did this abridgment. Then I glanced at the last page. This is how Morgenstern ends it. Buttercup looked at him. Oh, my Wesley, so do I. From behind them, suddenly closer than they imagined, they could hear the roar of Humperdinck. Stop them! Cut them off! They were admittedly startled, but there was no reason for worry. They were on the fastest horses in the kingdom, and the lead was already theirs. However, this was before Inigo's wound reopened, and Wesley relapsed again, and Fezzik took the wrong turn, and Buttercup's horse threw a shoe, and the night behind them was filled with the crescendoing sounds of pursuit. That's Morgenstern's ending, a Lady or the Tiger type effect. This was before the Lady or the Tiger, remember. Now, he was a satirist, so he left it that way, and my father was, I guess, I realized too late, a romantic, so he ended it another way. Well, I'm an abridger, so I'm entitled to a few ideas of my own. Did they make it? Was the pirate ship there? You can answer it for yourself. But for me, I say yes, it was. And yes, they got away and got their strength back and had lots of adventures and more than their share of laughs. That doesn't mean that I think they had a happy ending either. Because, in my opinion anyway, they squabbled a lot. And Buttercup lost her looks eventually. And one day Fezzik lost a fight and some hotshot kid whipped Inigo with a sword. And Wesley was never able to really sleep sound because of Humperdinck maybe being on the trail. I'm not trying to make this a downer, understand? I mean, I really do think that love is the best thing in the world, except for cough drops. But I also have to say, for the umpty-umpth time, that life isn't fair. It's just fairer than death. That's all. The way in which William Goldman, brings together these different layers, the way in which he shatters the walls between these layers by having his authorial avatar, Bill Goldman, interrogate both the original, right? Because we've been talking about the 3 layers of authorial intent here, but there is, of course, a 4th layer of authorial intent, and that is Bill Goldman's father. That is the father who originally read this story. He is himself a kind of author of this story. And we shatter the dimensional barriers between these different interpretations, and we find what? Well, dissatisfaction in every regard, I suppose. We find the dissatisfaction of, and they all lived happily ever after, to which young Bill says, I'm sorry, what, is that it? Is that really the end of the pirate ship? Are we okay? Like, does the story actually end happily, or are you just telling me that the story ends happily? Then we get Morgenstern's doing his Lady or the Tiger, this unresolved cliffhanger ending, which was so passé even by this point in 1973, where they're racing through the forest and it's all going to be okay, but then Inigo's wound reopens and Wesley relapses again, and Fezzik takes the wrong turn and Buttercup's horse threw a shoe, and the night behind them was filled with the crescendoing sound of pursuit. And we'll never know what happens next to our characters. Also, fundamentally dissatisfying. And then even here in the abridged version, Bill Goldman goes out of his way to remove any possible narrative satisfaction from the end of this story, right? Yes, they got away. They got their strength back and had lots of adventures and more than their share of laughs. The end. Little curlicue postscript. That's it. We're done. We're out. Thanks for listening. Oh no, there's a little more. But that doesn't mean I think they had a happy ending either, because now Bill Goldman is not talking about his adolescent, his juvenile experience of this book. Now he's talking about his adult experience of this book and of the world. In my opinion anyway, they squabbled a lot. And Buttercup lost her looks eventually. And one day Fezzik lost a fight and some hotshot kid whipped an ego with a sword and Wesley was never able to really sleep because of Humperdinck maybe being on the trail. This is what adult life is. There's never an ending. Human beings aren't good at periods, as Robert Browning said, right? We're not good at ending stories. Stories don't end the way that they do in stories. Real life just goes on. It just goes on until you reach the point where you regret the absence of the end of a story. Or if you're lucky, you begin a new story. You move on to something else. Bill Goldman is not going to move on to a new story. Bill Goldman is lamenting the loss of that innocence which so inspired him as a youth. I'm not trying to make this a downer, understand? I mean, I really do think that love is the best thing in the world, he asserts, then immediately undercuts with, except for cough drops. But I also have to say for the umpty-umpth time that life isn't fair. It's just fairer than death, that's all. One of the most interesting things that the movie version of The Princess Bride does is assert more powerfully an ending, both within the frame and without. And we're going to get the opportunity next week to talk about the 2 layers of the Princess Bride movie, right? We are going to distill this 4-layer cake, I suppose, into a sandwich? Is that the metaphor that I just inadvertently stumbled into? I suppose that it is. We're going to distill all of this out into 2 simple layers, the storyteller and the story itself, and that will allow us to talk more meaningfully about both. I cannot wait to talk about all of that next week. Let me see. I have a question here in the chat. Let me cancel this slide. I am so far over time. Who could have predicted that that would happen, talking about The Princess Bride? Did Goldman ever really love the book, asks Heroes and Bards, if the book he loved never really existed and was instead a fabrication of his father's making? See, Heroes and Bards, I think you have, as is your way, put your finger on it precisely. Did Goldman love the book? No, but he did love the story. The story that he was told is still a story, even if it was adapted on the fly by his father in the comfort of his bedroom, right? It doesn't need to be written on the page in order for it to be narratively true, emotionally true, metaphorically true, symbolically true. It was true to young Bill, and it meant something to him. And when he went looking for that book, when he went looking for that story, when he went looking for that experience again, he went back to the same book and found that the story had changed. The story was not what he thought it was, even though the book physically was exactly the same. That is what happens when we return to the things that we loved as children, or that is at least what can happen when we return to the things that we loved as children. When you read a book at the age of 9 and it blew open the doors of your world, it transformed your perspective, it made you the person that you are today, and you go back and you find that same book and you read it again, you are not getting the same story. Because stories are a conversation. Stories are interactive. The book is fixed. The book exists across time and across space, but you do not. And your interaction with that book is going to generate alchemically something very different than the interaction of 9-year-old you and that self-same book or that self-same movie or that self-same TV show. But here's the trick. So often this can make us jaded. So often this can either, because the internet exists, I suppose, this can drive us to defend the indefensible. No, actually, you guys, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe is a work of unappreciated genius. And yeah, I know it was important to me when I was 11, but it's also really good and you just need to watch it and maybe you're not smart enough to understand it. Let me write a 5,000-word think piece for Medium about how great it is. No. We don't have to do that. What you can say, and it is sufficient, is when I was 11, I loved He-Man. He-Man made me who I am, or Anne of Green Gables made me who I am, or Jonathan Livingston Seagull made me who I am, or Moby Dick, or The Princess Bride made me who I am. That is a consistent experience. That emotional, resonant truth persists, even if your relationship with the source material changes. That is a great note. I think this disambiguation between story and text is a perfect note upon which to end this somewhat extended Point North one-shot here. You guys, thank you so much for joining me. Obviously, I've been talking about The Princess Bride. Or technically, I suppose I've been talking about The Princess Bride for the longest time. It has been an absolute thrill to delve back into this book and share it all with all of you and explore it all in your fine company. Thank you so much for listening. If you would like to talk more about The Princess Bride, may I direct you over to the Point North Media Forum, pointnorthmedia.com/forum, where you can hang out with the finest Colombian academics over there. Colombian? Both from Columbia, the country, and also the university. I suppose that's, again, what I have inadvertently stumbled into. You can go and discuss The Princess Bride over on the forum, is what I'm saying. It's a very good place to do exactly that. I will be back next week, next Wednesday night, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, for our discussion of the movie, and that will be followed maybe the following weekend. I'll take a look at my schedule and see when I can fit it in, but it's a perfect opportunity, as I said at the beginning of tonight's session, to kick the tires of the new YouTube broadcast infrastructure, so we'll probably do that too, and we'll have a live commentary track / discussion for The Princess Bride. I cannot wait. Thank you all so much